Good evening. Hope everybody's doing okay in these very trying times. I would like to continue this evening with some more concepts surrounding the Arba Banim, the four sons of the Haggadah. In the Haggadah Sefer Hazmanim, the Beis Yaakov of Ishbitz makes an interesting observation. He says, why is it that right after we mention about the going out of Mitzrayim, going out of Egypt, do we start talking about the four sons? And he says, because the minute we came out of Egypt and we came out into the light, we began to separate from one another. And that as long as they were in the darkness, they were all gathered together. He says, similar to what we find that Yaakov and Esav were initially together within Rivka, but as soon as they were born, they each separated and went in their own direction. We could spend a lot of time analyzing and understanding what he means, but I'm just going to simply apply his message to what's going on in the world today. That in the darkness that we find ourselves and the trouble, we're finding in a lot of ways a lot of unity that was unfortunately missing so often, now all of a sudden is very present. And it's unfortunate that maybe you can call me a skeptic, but people might, like me, wonder that once we step back out in the light, is that unity going to remain? Or are we all of a sudden all going to go into our own separate ways? Just a little bit of food for thought. Again, from the Haggadah of, excuse me, Beis Avraham, Beis Aaron, on the Chacham, on the wise son, he analyzes a little bit the wording that is said in the answer to the Ben Chacham. The wording says, Va'af ata emorlo ki hilchos haPesach. Also, you should say to him like the laws of Pesach. And he says that when he had gone to the Seder by the Belzerav, remember we're talking about pre-war now, the Belzerav said, why doesn't it say that you should tell him Hilchos HaPesach, the laws of Pesach? Why does it say Kir Hilchos HaPesach, to tell him like the laws of Pesach? What's this like doing over there? And he explains, because when you're telling over the story of the Exodus from Mitzrayim, it isn't good enough just to stay over the story in a manner of rote. But the idea is you want to tell over the story in a way that it's going to remain by people. The inspiration, the feeling, the emotions of the story are going to remain by those who have sat through the Seder and listened to your story. And that's similar to the Afikoman, because Ein Maftirin Achar Pesach Afikoman means that after we would eat the Korban Pesach, we want the taste of the Korban Pesach to remain in our mouths. So he explains that's what we're saying over here, that when our son asks us what's the law, we tell him the law of telling over the story is like the law of the Korban Pesach. That just like you want to eat the Korban Pesach in a manner in which the taste is going to remain with you, also the story you're supposed to tell tonight should be told over in a manner that it will stay with those who are listening. The next thing I want to share with you is something I saw many years ago in the name of Rav Shimon Schwab. And that is when it comes to the Tam, the simple son, who asks the question, Ma Zos, what's this? And Rashi actually in Chumash describes this as a foolish question. And in context, it's talking about that there is a halacha that if a person has a firstborn donkey, he has two options of what to do with the firstborn donkey according to the Torah. Option one is to decapitate the firstborn donkey, and option number two is to redeem the firstborn donkey on a sheep and give the sheep to a Kohen. And this question of mazos is asked in the context of this Tom, this simple son, seeing that their donkey has just given birth to a baby donkey, and his father is going out and decapitating the baby donkey. And the kid is saying, mazos, what's this? And Rashi, based on the Medrash, describes this as a foolish question. Rav Schwab asks, why is the question so foolish? I mean, after all, a baby animal is a very precious thing. It has a monetary value to a farmer, and the fact that the father is now taking it and decapitating it, destroying this thing, it seems to be a perfectly reasonable question to ask, mazos, what's this? What are you doing? So Rav Schwab explains with a parable, and I'm going to change the parable a little bit to make it somewhat more contemporary. Imagine if a person goes to sleep one night in his bed, and when he wakes up in the morning, he finds himself in what basically looks to be the cockpit of some sort of a spaceship. And he looks around, and there's switches all over the place, and there's dials here and there, and he has no clue how in the world he ended up where he is, and what this command center, whatever, all of these controls, what's going on. And as he's sitting there looking around, trying to figure out what's going on, suddenly someone else comes walking in. So he sees the person walking in, and he points to one switch, and he says, "What's this?" That's a stupid question, a foolish question. Why? Because that question can't possibly be answered. Because if you don't have any context, if you don't know where you are and what the purpose of this entire vehicle is, I can't possibly begin to explain to you what one switch is. In a similar manner, Rav Schwab explains that this Ben Tam, this simple son, has spent his whole life not bothering to ask a single question. And he completely does not have any context whatsoever for the mitzvos of the Torah. He doesn't really understand that. And if he doesn't understand the most fundamental points of the Torah, why we have the Torah, what the Torah is meant for, what does God want from us, I can't possibly explain to him the meaning behind one mitzvah. So that's why Rashi refers to it as a foolish question, because it's a question that simply cannot be answered. I'm going to return now to the Chalban, which I shared with you so much the other night, and explain to you a couple of more things that he says about the four sons. On the question of the Chacham, the wise son, the Chalban says it's very interesting, because if you look in the Torah, where the question of the wise son is found in the Psukim, it doesn't seem like the answer that's given to him relates back to the question. Because the Pasuk says that the wise son is going to say, Ma'edos v'achukim v'amishpatim. He's asking questions about all of the laws that Hashem has given to us. And in answer, we tell her we were slaves to Para Mitzrayim. Hashem took us out with a strong hand. Hashem did all sorts of miracles and wonders against the Egyptians and Pharaoh and his whole family. He took us out of there in order to bring us to the land which he promised to our forefathers. And therefore Hashem commanded us to do all of these commandments. And it will be considered to be a great righteousness if we do what God asks us to do. So the Chabam points out, the son asked, what are these laws? and the father doesn't tell him the laws. Instead, the father goes into the reason behind why we should do the mitzvos, instead of telling us anything about the mitzvos. So the Chabad explains, because the question about the laws of Pesach, that's an intellectual question. It's a question that's asking for information. But the question as to why we do the mitzvos is not a question which is dependent on intellect. It's a question which depends on the person's will, on the person's desire to serve God. And he goes on to explain that the reason why the father doesn't answer the son directly to his question is because the father is not really impressed with his son's intellect and his son's desire to get into a whole discussion about the halacha. The father wants to make sure that the son has a heart inside of himself that wishes to serve God. And he says this is the fundamental point that's going on over here. We don't want him just to be an intellectual. We want him to be a righteous person with a heart that wants to serve his creator. He says oftentimes we will find people who have a great desire for wisdom, but their hearts are very distant and their hearts are not really in it. And he says there's a great danger that the intellect can completely cover up the heart. And it can end up completely distorting a person's focus in terms of his service of God. That's why the Torah tells us that if your son comes to you on Pesach night and he wants to know all sorts of details about the halachos, ignore his question. Don't answer what he's asking you. Rather, you should focus on something that's much more important and much more fundamental. Teach him about who God is. Teach him about what God has done for us, in order that he should have a desire to serve God. Don't just give him knowledge, give him a pure heart. Don't just give him intellect, give him proper character, give him humility, because these are really the vessels that will then enable him to apply his intellect to the Torah to its fullest. And this is not just a minor point, but this is something that's extremely fundamental, because a person who is intellectual, but his heart is not connected to the will of God, is apt to end up straying until his Torah can end up being completely superficial. He might be full of all sorts of pilpul in Torah, but it's going to be pilpul without a solid foundation. His heart will be full of hubris and stubbornness and the stench of wickedness. And that's why Pesach night is the opportunity to instill all of those good traits within one's children. And finally, this evening, I'd like to share with you what the Chalban has to say about the Rasha, the wicked son. The Rasha asks, Ma ha'avoda hazos lachem? What is the service for you? The Rasha sees the avoda, the service, as being a very bitter yoke. He doesn't have the ability to appreciate it from an intellectual standpoint, and certainly not from a spiritual standpoint. Why is that? So it's as the Hagaddah says, Ulefi shahotzi atzmo min haklal, because he removed himself from the general populace by saying lachem, for you, velo lo, and he's not part of it. This feeling of distance from serving God is connected from his feeling of distance from the Jewish people as a whole. Because one of the most important points for someone to truly appreciate the sweetness of Torah and its depth is it's being connected to Klal Yisrael as a whole and is feeling a spiritual connection to the entire Jewish nation. That's the concept we find by Matan Torah at Mount Sinai, Ki ish echad b'lev echad, that Klal Yisrael were as one man with one heart. That's the root and the fundamental basis for the acceptance of Torah. Because the light of Torah, the great powerful light, it directs the entire nation and it uplifts all of existence to its ultimate purpose. But if someone is only within his own boundaries and only focused on his own existence and doesn't feel a connection to the rest of the nation, he is going to find the Torah as a yoke that's forcing him to give up on his own ambitions of life. But it's very necessary in order for a person to really connect to Torah is to connect to all of Klal Yisrael. He doesn't say this, but we know as the Zohar says, Yisrael v'oraisa v'kudsha brichu chadhu, the Jewish nation, Torah and Hashem are one. Good evening.